Hello everyone, this is Dawn. Today I'm going to be reading a short story by E.F. Benson titled A Tale of an Empty House. For a little bit of history, this story was first published in Hutchinson's magazine in June of 1925. 3 years later, it was included in E.F. Benson's anthology, Spook Stories. Many years later, in 1986, the story was given extra prominence when it was republished as the focal story in the anthology The Tale of an Empty House and Other Stories. Sadly, by that time, E.F. Benson had been gone from us for 46 years. A Tale of an Empty House is set in England on the Norfolk coast. The central character and his friend are forced to take shelter there during a sudden downpour and encounter the wraith of a ghost of a limping man. On to the story. A Tale of an Empty House by E.F. Benson. It had been a disastrous afternoon. Rain had streamed incessantly from a low gray sky, and the road was of the vilest description. There were sections consisting of sharp flints, newly laid down and not yet rolled into amity, and the stretches in between were worn into deep ruts and bouncing holes, so that it was impossible anywhere to travel at even a moderate speed. Twice we had punctured, and now, as the stormy dusk began to fall, something went wrong with the engine. And after crawling on for 100 yards or so, we stopped. My driver, after a short investigation, told me that there was a half-hour's tinkering to be done, and after that we might, with luck, trundle along in a leisurely manner and hope eventually to arrive at Crowthorpe, which was the proposed destination. We had come, when this stoppage occurred, to a crossroads. Through the driving rain I could see on the right a great church, and in front a huddle of houses. A consultation of the map seemed to indicate that this was the village of Riddington. The guidebook added the information that Riddington possessed a hotel, and the signpost at the corner endorsed them both. To the right, along the main road, to which we had just struck, was Crowthorpe, 15 miles away and straight in front of us. Half a mile distant was the hotel. The decision was not difficult. There was no reason why I should get to Crowthorpe tonight instead of tomorrow, for the friend whom I was to meet there would not arrive until the next afternoon, and it was surely better to limp half a mile with a spasmodic engine than attempt 15 on this inclement evening. "We'll spend the night there," I said to my chauffeur. "The road dips downhill, and only half a mile to the hotel. I dare say we shall get there without using the engine at all. Let's try, anyhow." We hooted and crossed the main road and began to slide very slowly down a narrow street. It was impossible to see much, but on either side there were little houses, with lights gleaming through blinds, or with blinds still undrawn, revealing cozy interiors. Then the incline grew steeper, and close in front of us I saw masts against a sheet of water that appeared to stretch unbroken into the rain-shrouded gloom of the gathering night. Riddington, then, must be on the open sea, though how it came about that boats should be tied up to an open quay wall was a puzzle. But perhaps there was some jetty, invisible in the darkness, which protected them. I heard the chauffeur switch on his engine, and we made a sharp turn to the left, and we passed below a long row of lighted windows, shining out onto the rather narrow road, and the right edge of which the water lapped. Again he turned sharply to the left, and described a half-circle on crunching gravel, and drew up to the door of the hotel. There was a room for me, there was a garage, there was a room for him, and dinner had not long begun. Among the little excitements and surprises of travel, there is none more delightful than that of waking in a new place at which one has arrived after nightfall on the previous evening. The mind has received a few hints and dusky impressions, and probably during sleep it has juggled with these, constructing them into some sort of coherent whole, and next morning its anticipations are put to the proof. Usually, the eye has seen more than has consciously registered, and the brain has fitted together, as in the manner of a jigsaw puzzle, a very a very fair presentment of its immediate surroundings. When I woke the next morning, a brilliantly sunny sky looked in at my windows. There was no sound of wind or of breaking waves, and before getting up and verifying my impression of the night before, I lay and washed in my imagined picture. In front of my windows there would be a narrow roadway bordered by a quay wall. Then there would be a breakwater, forming a harbor for the boats to lay at anchor there. And away to the horizon would stretch an expanse of still and glittering sea. I ran over these points in my mind. They seemed an inevitable inference from the glimpses of the night before, and then, assured of my correctness, I got out of bed and went to the window. I have never experienced so complete a surprise. There was no harbor, there was no breakwater, and there was no sea. A very narrow channel, 3/4 choked with sandbanks, on which now rested the boats whose masts I had seen the previous evening, ran parallel to the road, and then turned at right angles and went off into the distance. Otherwise, no water of any sort was visible. Right and left and in front stretched a limitless expanse of shining grasses with tufts of shabby growth, and great patches of purple sea lavender. Beyond were tawny sandbanks, and further yet a line of shingle and scrub and sand dunes. But the sea, which I had expected to fill the whole circle of the visible world till it met the sky on the horizon, had totally disappeared. After the first surprise that this colossal conjuring trick was over, I dressed quickly, in order to ascertain from the local authorities how it was done. Unless some hallucination had poisoned my perceptive facilities, there had to be an explanation of this total disappearance, alternately of sea and land, and the key, when supplied, was simple enough. The line of shingle and scrub and sand dunes on the horizon was a peninsula, running for 4 or 5 miles parallel with the land, forming the true beach. And it enclosed this vast basin of sandbanks and mudbanks and level lavender-covered marsh, which was submerged at high tide and made an estuary. At low tide it was altogether empty but for the stream that struggled through the various channels to the mouth of it 2 miles away and to the left, and there was easy passage across it for a man who carried his shoes and stockings, to the far sand dunes and the beaches which terminated at Reddington Point, while at high tide you could sail out from the quay just in front of the hotel and be landed there. The tide would be out of the estuary for 5 or 6 hours yet. I could spend the morning on the beach, or, taking my lunch, walk out to the point and be back before the returning waters rendered the channel impassable. There was good bathing on the beach, and there was a colony of terns who nested there. Already, as I ate my breakfast at a table in the window overlooking the marsh, the spell and attraction of it had begun to work. It was so immense and so empty. It had the allure of the desert about it, with none of the desert's intolerable monotony, for companies of chiding gulls hovered over it, and I could hear the pipe of redshank and the babble of curlews. I was due to meet Jack Granger in Crowthorpe that evening, but if I went, I knew I should persuade him to come back to Riddington, and from my knowledge of him, I was aware that he would feel the spell of the place not less potent than I. So, having ascertained that there was a room for him here, I wrote him a note, saying that I had found the most amazing place in the world, and told my chauffeur to take the car into Crowthorpe to meet the train that afternoon and bring him here. And with a perfectly clear conscience, I set off with a towel and a packet of lunch in my pocket to explore vaguely and goallessly that beckoning immensity of lavender-covered, bird-haunted expanse. My way, as pointed out to me, led first along a sea bank, which defended the drained pasture land on the right of it from the high tides, and at the corner of that I struck into the basin of the estuary. A contour line of jetsam, withered grass, strands of seaweed, and bleached shells of little crabs showed where the last tide had reached its height, and inside the marsh growth was still wet. Then came a stretch of mud and pebbles, and presently I was wading through the stream that flowed down into the sea. Beyond that were banks of ribbed sand swept by the incoming tides, and soon I regained the wide green marshes on the further side, beyond which was the bar of shingle that fringed the sea. I paused as I reshod myself. There was not a sign of any living human being within sight, but never have I found myself in so exhilarating a solitude. Right and left were spread the lawns of sea lavender, starred with pink tufts of thrift and thicket of sueta bushes. Here and there were pools left in depressions of the ground by the retreating tide, and there were patches of smooth black mud, out of which grew, like little spikes of milky green asparagus, a crop of glasswort. And all these happy vegetables flourished in sunshine or rain or the salt of the flooding tides with impartial amphibiousness. Overhead was the immense arc of the sky, across which flew now a flight of duck, hurrying with necks outstretched, and now a lonely black-backed gull flapping his ponderous way seawards. Curlews were bubbling, and redshank and ringed plover fluting, and now, as I trudged up the shingle bank, at the bottom of which the marsh came to an end, the sea, blue and waveless, lay stretched and sleeping, bordered by a strip of sand, on which, far off, a mirage hovered. But from end to end of it, as far as the eye can see, there was no sign of human presence. I bathed and basked on the hot beach, walked along for half a mile, then struck back across the shingle into the marsh. And then, with a pang of disappointment, I saw the first evidence of the intrusion of man into this paradise of solitude. For on a stony spit of ground that ran like some great rib into the amphibious meadows, there stood a small square house built of brick, with a tall flagstaff set up in the front of it. It had not caught my eye before, and it seemed an unwarrantable invasion of the emptiness. But perhaps it was not so gross an infringement of it as it appeared, for it wore an indefinable look of desertion, as if man had attempted to domesticate himself here, and had failed. As I approached it, this impression increased, for the chimney was smokeless, the closed windows were dim with the film of salt air, and the threshold of the closed door was patched with lichen and strewn with debris of withered grasses. I walked twice round it, decided that it was certainly uninhabited, and finally, leaning against the sun-baked wall, ate my lunch. The glitter and heat of the day were at their height. Warm and exercised and invigorated by my bathe, I felt strung to the supreme pitch of physical well-being, and my mind, quite vacant except for these felicitous impressions, followed the example of my body and basked in an unclouded content. And I suppose by a sense of the Lucretan luxury of contrast, it began to picture to itself, in order to accentuate these blissful conditions, what this sunlit solitude would be like when some November night began to close in underneath a low gray sky and a driving storm of sleet. Its solitariness would be turned into abominable desolation if, from some unconjurable cause, one was forced to spend the night here. How the mind would long for any companionship, how sinister would become the calling of the birds, how weird the whistle of the wind round the cavern of this abandoned habitation. Or would it be just the other way about, and would one only be longing to be assured that the seeming solitude was real, and that no invisible but encroaching presence, soon to be made manifest, was creeping nearer under cover of the dusk, and be shuddering to think that the wail of the wind was not only the wind, but the cry of some discarnate being, and that it was not the curlews who made that melancholy piping. By degrees the edge of thought grew blunt and melted into inconsequent imaginings, and I fell asleep. I woke with a start from the trouble of a dream that faded with waking, but felt sure that some noise close at hand had aroused me. And then it came again, It was the footfall of someone moving about inside the deserted house, against the wall of which my back was propped. Up and down it went, then paused and began again. It was like that of a man who waited with impatience for some expected arrival. I noticed also that the footfall had an irregular beat, as if the walker went with a limp. Then, in a minute or two, the sound ceased altogether. An odd uneasiness came over me, for I had been so certain that the house was uninhabited. Then, turning my head, I noticed that in the wall just above me was a window, and the notion, wholly irrational and unfounded, entered my mind that the man inside who tramped was watching me from it. When once that idea got a hold of me, it became impossible to sit there in peace any more, and I got up and shoveled into my knapsack my towel and the remains of my meal. I walked a little further down the spit of land which ran out into the marsh, and turning, looked at the house again, and again to my eyes it seemed absolutely deserted. But after all, it was no concern of mine, and I proceeded on my walk, determining to inquire casually on my return to the hotel who it was that lived in so hermetical a place, and for the present dismissed the matter from my mind. It was some 3 hours later that I found myself opposite the house again, after a long wandering walk. I saw that, by making only a slightly longer detour, I could pass close to the house again, and I knew that the sound of those footsteps within had raised in me a curiosity that I wanted to satisfy. And then, even as I paused, I saw that a man was standing by the door. How he came there I had no idea, for the moment before he had not been there, and he must have come out of the house. He was looking down the path that led through the marsh, shielding his eyes against the sun, and presently he took a step or two forward and dragged his left leg as he walked, limping heavily. It was his step, then, which I had heard within, and any mystery about the matter was of my own making. I therefore took the shorter path and got back to the hotel to find that Jack Granger had just arrived. We went out again into the gleam of the sunset and watched the tide sweeping in and pouring up the dikes, until again the great conjuring trick was accomplished, and the stretch of marsh with its field of sea lavender was a sheet of shining water. Far away across it stood the house by which I had launched, and just as we turned, Jack pointed it out. "That's a queer place for a house," he said. "I suppose no one lives there?" "Yes, a lame man," I said. "I saw him today. I was going to ask the hotel porter who he is." The result of this inquiry was unexpected. "No, the house has been uninhabited for several years," he said. "It used to be a watch house, for which the Coast Guard signaled if there was a ship in distress, and the lifeboat went out from there. But now the lifeboat and the Coast Guards are at the end of the point." "Then who is the lame man I saw walking there and heard inside the house?" I asked. He looked at me, I thought, queerly. "I don't know who that could be," he said. "There's no lame man about here to my knowledge." The effect on Jack of the marshes and their gorgeous emptiness, of the sun and the sea, was precisely what I had anticipated. He vowed that any day spent anywhere than on those beaches and fields of sea lavender was a day wasted, and proposed that the tour, of which the main object had originally been the golf links of Norfolk, should for the present be cancelled. In particular, it was the birds of this long solitary headland that had enchanted him. "After all, we can play golf anywhere," he said. "There's an oyster-catcher scolding, do you hear? And how silly to whack a little white ball. Ringed plover! And what's that calling as well? When you can spend a day like this. Oh, don't let us go and bathe yet. I want to wander along the edge of the marsh. There's a company of turnstones. They make a noise like the drawing of a cork. There they are, those little chaps with chestnut-colored patches. Let's go along the near edge of the marsh and come out by the house where your lame man lives." We took, therefore, the path with the longer detour, which I had abandoned last night. I had said nothing to him of what the hotel porter had told me, that the house was unlived in, and all he knew was that I had seen a lame man apparently in occupation there. My reason for not doing so, to make the confession at once, was that I already half believed that the steps I had heard inside, and the lame man I'd seen watching outside, did not imply, in the porter's sense of the word, that the house was occupied, and I wanted to see whether Jack, as well as myself, would be conscious of any such tokens of a presence there. And then the oddest thing happened. All the way up to the house, his attention was alert on the birds, in especial on a piping note which was unfamiliar to him. In vain he tried to catch sight of the bird that uttered it, and in vain I tried to hear it. "It doesn't sound like any bird I know," he said. "In fact, it doesn't sound like a bird at all, but like some human being whistling. There it is again! Is it possible you don't hear it?" We were now quite close to the house. "There must be someone there who's whistling," he said. "It must be your lame man." "Lord, yes, it comes from inside the house, so that's explained. I hoped it was some new bird, but why can't you hear it?" "Some people can't hear a bat squeak," I said. Jack, satisfied with the explanation, took no more interest in the matter, and we struck across the shingle, bathed and launched, and tramped on to the tumble of sand dunes in which the point ended. For a couple of hours we strolled and lazed there in the liquid and sunny air, and reluctantly returned in order to cross the ford before the tide came in. As we retraced our way, I saw coming up from the west a huge continent of cloud, and just as we reached the spit of land on which the house stood, a jagged sword of lightning flickered down in the low-lying hills across the estuary, and a few big raindrops plopped onto the shingle. "We're in for a drenching," he said. "Ha! Let's ask for shelter at your lame man's house. Better run for it!" Already the big drops were falling thickly as we scuttled across the 100 yards that lay between us and the house, and came to the door just as the sluices of heaven were pulled wide. He rapped on it, but there came no answer. He tried the handle of it, but the door did not yield, and then, by a sudden inspiration, he felt along the top of the lintel and found a key. It fitted into the wards, and next moment we stood within. We found ourselves in a slip of a passage, at the end of which went up the staircase to the floor above. On each side of it was a room, one kitchen, the other a living room, but in neither was there any stick of furniture. Discolored paper was peeling off the walls, the windows were thick with spidery weavings, the air heavy with unventilated damp. "Your lame man dispenses with the necessities as well as the luxuries of life," said Jack. "A Spartan fellow." We were standing in the kitchen. Outside, the hiss of the rain had grown to a roar, and the blurred window was suddenly lit up with a flare of lightning. A crack of thunder answered it, and in the silence that followed there came from just outside, audible now to me, the sound of a piping whistle. Immediately afterwards I heard the door by which we had just entered violently bang, and I remembered that I had left it open. His eyes met mine. "But there's no breath of wind," he said. "What made it bang like that?" "And that was no bird that whistled," said he. There was a shuffle in the passage outside of a limping step. I could hear the drag of the man's lame foot along the boards. "He has come in," said Jack. Yes, he had come in. And who had come in? At that moment, not fright, but fear, which is a very different matter, closed in on me. Fright, as I understand it, is an emotion, startling but not unnerving. You may, under the finger of fright, spring aside, you may scream, you may shout, you have the command of your muscles. But as the limping step moved down the passage, I felt fear. The hand of the nightmare that, as it clutches, paralyzes and inhibits not action only, but thought. I waited frozen and speechless for what should happen next. Exactly opposite the open door of the kitchen in which we stood, the step stopped, and then, soundlessly and invisibly, the presence that had made itself manifest to the outward ear entered. Suddenly, I heard Jack's breath rattle in his throat. "Oh my God!" he cried in a voice hoarse and strangled, and he threw his left arm across his face as if defending himself, and his right arm, shooting out, seemed to hit at something which I could not see, and his fingers crooked themselves as if clutching at that which had evaded his blow. His body was bent back, as if resisting some invisible pressure, then lunged forward again, and I heard the noise of a resisting joint, and saw on his throat the shadow, or so it seemed, of a clutching hand. At that, some power of movement came back to me, and I remembered hurling myself at the empty space between him and me, and I felt under my grip the shape of a shoulder, and heard on the boards of the floor the slip and scoop of a foot. Something invisible, now a shoulder, now an arm, struggled in my grasp, and I heard the panting respiration that was not Jack's or mine, and now and then in my face I felt a hot breath that stank of corruption and decay. And all the time this physical contention was symbolical only. What he and I wrestled with was not a thing of flesh and blood, but some awful spiritual presence. And then there was nothing. The ghostly invasion ceased as suddenly as it had begun, and there was Jack's face gleaming with sweat so close to mine. And as we stood with dropped arms opposite each other in an empty room, with the rain beating on the roof and the gutters chuckling, no word passed between us. But next moment we were out in the pelting rain, running for the ford. The deluge was sweet to my soul. It seemed to wash away that horror of great darkness and that odor of corruption in which we had been plunged. Now, I have no certain explanation to give of the experience which has here been shortly recounted, and the reader here may or may not connect with it a story that I heard a week or two later on my return to London. A friend of mine and I had been dining at my house one evening, and we had discussed a murder trial then going on of which the papers were full. "It isn't only the atrocity that attracts," he said. "I think it is the place where the murder occurs that is the cause of the interest in it. A murder at Brighton or Margate or Ramsgate, any place which the public associates with pleasure trips, attracts them because they know the place and can visualize the scene. But when there is a murder at some small, unknown spot, which they have never heard of, there is no appeal to their imagination. Last spring, for instance, there was that murder at that small village on the coast of Norfolk. I've forgotten the name of the place, though I was in Norwich at the time of the trial and was present in court. It was one of the most awful stories I ever heard, as ghastly and sensational as this last affair, but it didn't attract the smallest attention. Odd that I can't remember the name of the place when all the rest is so vivid to me." "Tell me about it," I said. "I've never heard of it." "Well, there was this little village, and just outside it was a farm owned by a man called John Beardsley. He lived there with his only daughter, an unmarried woman of about 30, a good-looking, sensible creature, apparently, the last in the world you would have thought to do anything unexpected. There worked at the farm as a day laborer a young fellow called Alfred Mowden, who, in the trial of which I am speaking, was the prisoner. He had one of the most dreadful faces I ever saw, a cat-like receding forehead, a broad, short nose, and a great red, sensual mouth, always on the grin. He seemed positively to enjoy being the central figure round whom all the interest of those ghoulish women who thronged the court was concentrated, and when he shambled into the witness box— "Shambled?" I asked. "Yes, he was lame. His left foot dragged along the floor as he walked. As he shambled into the witness box, he nodded and smiled to the judge, and clapped his counsel on the shoulder, and leered at the gallery. He worked on the farm, as I was saying, doing jobs that were within his capacity, among which was certain housework, carrying coals and whatnot. For John Beardsley, though very well off, kept no servant, and this daughter, Alice, that was her name, ran the house. And what must she do but fall in love? It was no less than that with this monstrous and misshapen fellow. One afternoon her father came home unexpectedly and caught them together in the parlour, kissing and cuddling. He turned the man out of the house, neck and crop, gave him a week's wages, and dismissed him, threatening him with a fine thrashing if he ever caught him hanging about the place. He forbade his daughter ever to speak to him again, and in order to keep watch over her, got in a woman from the village who would be there all day while he was out on the farm. Young Maldon, deprived of his job, tried to get work in the village, but none would employ him, for he was a black-tempered fellow ready to pick a quarrel with anyone, and an unpleasant opponent for, with all his lameness, he was of immense muscular strength. For some weeks he idled about in the village getting a chance job occasionally, and no doubt, as you will see, Alice Beardsley managed to meet him. The village, its name still escapes me, lay on the edge of a big tidal estuary, full at high water, but on the ebb of a broad stretch of marsh and sand and mudbanks, beyond which ran a long belt of shingle that formed the seaward side of the estuary. On it stood a disused coastguard house, a couple of miles away from the village, and in as lonely a place as you would find anywhere in England. At low tide there was a shallow ford across it, and in the sandbanks round about in some beds of cockle. Maldon, unable to get regular work, took to cockle digging, and during the summer, when the tide was low, Alice, it was no new thing for her, used to go over the ford to the beach beyond and bathe. She would go across the sandbanks where the cockle diggers, Maldon among them, were at work, and if he whistled as she passed, that was the signal between them that he would slip away presently and join her at the disused coastguard house, and there, throughout the summer, they used to meet. As the weeks went on, her father saw the change that was coming in her, and, suspecting the cause, often left his work and, hidden behind some sea bank, used to watch her. One day he saw her cross the ford, and soon after she had passed, he saw Maldon, recognizable from a long way off by his dragging leg, follow her. He went up the path to the coastguard house and entered. At that John Beardsley crossed the ford, and hiding in the bushes near the house, saw Alice coming back from her bathe. The house was off the direct path to the ford, but she went round that way, and the door was opened to her and closed behind her. He found them together, and, mad with rage, attacked the man. They fought, and Maldon got him down, and then and there, in front of his daughter, strangled him. The girl went off ahead, and is in the asylum at Norwich now. She sits all day by the window whistling. The man was hanged. Was Riddington the name of the village? I asked. Yes, Riddington, of course, he said. I can't think how I forgot it.